When you hear science and religion, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's probably a battlefield, right? Two opposing forces locked in an epic war for the truth. But what if that's just a small part of a much bigger, much more interesting story? Today, we're going way beyond that simple conflict narrative. We're going to explore the fascinating and honestly often surprising relationship between them. Let's get into it. All right, to kick things off, let's start with a really provocative question. The story of Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus. It's a huge moment in Christianity. This is the event that turned a persecutor of Christians into the Apostle Paul. Now, traditionally, that's seen as a divine miracle. But what if it was something else? What if we could explain it scientifically?
And that question, well, it takes us right to this wild and, pretty controversial intersection of the brain and our most profound beliefs. We're diving into the science of mystical experience itself.
There's a name for this field, Neurotheology. And the core idea is kind of mind-bending. It suggests that every single experience we have, and no matter how spiritual or transcendent, has a physical footprint, a biological echo, somewhere in our brain cells. The goal here isn't necessarily to prove or disprove faith, but to understand the mechanics. How does our 3-pound brain actually create these incredibly powerful states of consciousness?
So, getting back to St. Paul, some neurotheologians have looked at a condition called temporal lobe epilepsy, or TLE. And when you put the symptoms side by side with Paul's account, the parallels are, well, they're pretty startling. TLE patients talk about these incredible ecstatic states, feeling lifted. Paul described being caught up to the third heaven. They have auditory hallucinations. Paul heard unutterable things. That feeling of being out of the body, classic TLE symptom. Then you add in temporary blindness after a seizure, and this thing called hypergraphia, a compulsive need to write. You know, from the guy who wrote most of the New Testament. You can see why this theory gets people talking.
So this brings us to the real heart of the matter. This is the crucial question. If you can map a spiritual revelation onto what's happening in the brain, does that make it less real? Does it diminish the meaning? Or could it be that the brain is just the physical hardware that these kinds of experiences run on? This tension right here is what pulls us out of this one specific case and into the much bigger, centuries-long conversation between science and faith.
And that whole conversation is often boiled down to one simple idea, the conflict thesis. It's the story we all kind of know, that science and religion have always been at war and always will be. But as we're about to see, that story might just be more of a myth than actual history.
Historians of science, like David C. Lindbergh, have a word for this view. He calls it a caricature. And that's exactly what it is, a distorted, oversimplified drawing. The whole idea of the Dark Ages, where the church was just stamping out science left and right, it's just not what the historical record shows. The real story is so much more complicated, and surprisingly, a lot more cooperative.
So if it wasn't a constant war, what was it? Well, a much better way to describe it is as a long, evolving dialogue.
I mean, think about it. Back in the Middle Ages, it was the church that was sponsoring the first universities, encouraging the study of what they called natural philosophy. You fast forward to the 17th century, and even Isaac Newton, the Isaac Newton, called his groundbreaking work in physics natural philosophy. The whole idea of a full-blown war between science and religion, that's actually a pretty modern invention. It really only took off in the 19th century.
Okay, so that's the history. But what about today? What does the relationship look like right now? Well, scholars have moved past the simple war idea. Instead, they talk about a spectrum of at least 4 different ways that science and religion can interact.
First, you've still got conflict. That's the classic idea that they're just at war. Second, there's independence. This is the idea that they're in separate rooms asking totally different questions. You know, science asks how and religion asks why. They don't overlap. Third, there's dialogue. This is where they can actually have a fruitful conversation because both rely on things like wonder, creativity, and critical thinking. And finally, there's integration, the idea that they can actually be combined, with one enriching the other.
Now, if you want to see a real-world example of those dialogue and integration models in action, you can look at the Templeton Prize. It's this major annual award designed to do exactly that, to foster the conversation.
And when I say major, I mean it. The prize money is over £1 million. And that's on purpose. It's deliberately set higher than the Nobel Prizes. The founder, Sir John Templeton, he felt that the Nobels totally overlooked the spiritual side of life, and he wanted to create an award that took it seriously. And just look at who's won this thing. It's not just theologians. We're talking about world-class scientists. People like the physicist Freeman Dyson, the biologist Francisco Ayala, and Francis Collins, the guy who led the Human Genome Project. These are absolute giants in their fields. It really shows that this isn't some fringe idea. It's a serious engagement with the scientific community.
But of course, the prize has its critics. No surprise there. Prominent atheist scientists like Richard Dawkins argue that it just blurs a line that should be crystal clear. But the defense is pretty powerful too. Get this. The 2011 winner Martin Rees, who is an atheist himself, he argues that exploring the biggest questions about the cosmos isn't promoting religion, it's just fundamental science. He sees the prize as a way to reward work that just makes our universe feel bigger and more wondrous.
So we've got this complex history, and we've got these modern debates. But what about the actual scientists working today? What do they believe? The real numbers? They might not be what you think.
So this Pew Research survey of scientists is wow. It's really telling. Okay, so 41% say they don't believe in God or a higher power. But look at the rest. A full third believe in God. Another 18% believe in some kind of universal spirit. So if you do the math, a majority of these scientists do hold some kind of spiritual belief. The big takeaway here is that there's no single scientist view. The community's way more diverse in its beliefs than the simple stereotype would have you believe.
So at the end of the day, the story of science and religion isn't one simple thing. It's not just a story of conflict. It's a messy, complex history of dialogue, a whole spectrum of modern relationships, and a really diverse set of personal beliefs. Which leads to one last big question. If there's no single, easy relationship between these two massive ways of understanding our world, what does that tell us about the nature of truth itself? Maybe the real point isn't about finding the one right answer, but about realizing that the hunt for truth is just so much richer when we're willing to look at it through more than one lens.